Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ad America. I'm Andrea, one of the e-guys here, and I hope everyone is doing well today. If you're new here, Ad America is the US Embassy's American Center, and our mission is to provide a space for young Indonesians to learn more about the United States. And our event for today is called Intensive Academic Writing Master the Basics with Top Professors. But before you jump into today's event, I would like to ask a trivia question of the day. In what year was the first academic journal published? Is it A, 1665, B, 1670, C, 1675, or D, 1680? You can submit your answer to our social media platform, and if you are able to answer correctly, you will be receiving a shout out later from us in the end of the event. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our facilitator for today, Ms. Linda Grove, Consulting Director from the Social Science Research Council. To our facilitator, the time is yours.
Okay, it's good to see you. Well, I can't see you all, but I hope I will see you all later when we get into discussions. Let me share the screen and we can begin. We're almost there. Okay. So what I want to do, what I was asked to talk about today is research as a career. I wasn't quite sure what exactly we should talk about, so I'm going to try to talking about my own personal experiences over the years, but try to then link those to somewhat more general problems that may be of interest to all of you. And where we're going is sort of, I'm going to do a brief biography so you know who I am and where I'm coming from. And then I will talk about some issues that have to do with how you discover what you want to do and how you proceed in a career or might proceed in a career. I should start by saying that I am an American who has made a career based in Japan, so it's a little bit different from what some of my American colleagues do. And I'm a historian, so what I have to say is specifically about a kind of field of the social sciences. However, along the way, I've worked in Japan for a long time, and I taught at a Japanese university and spent time as a dean and then as a vice president. And when I was vice president of the university, one of my areas of responsibility was, in fact, acquiring and supervising the use of research funds in all of the fields in our university, not just in the social sciences and humanities, but also in the natural sciences. And when I retired from the university, I was asked for 4 years to act as an advisor and kind of mini official at a place called Riken, which is one of Japan's big national science labs in the suburbs of Tokyo. The Japanese lab was trying, the big Japanese research center was trying to bring in foreign scholars. The aim was to have 30% of the young researchers, well, middle-aged researchers as well, at Riken coming from foreign countries. And my job was to help them sort of get used to life in Japan. So although I do not myself do research in the natural sciences or engineering or any of those kind of hard things, I do have some idea of what the life in those is all about, the kind of strains, etc. As for myself, I was born in Arkansas in the southern United States. My father is from a small town in Iowa, and my mother from a suburb of Washington, D.C. They met in Washington, D.C. when they were both working there. And my father worked for the government, so we moved around a lot until I was in high school, where I went to high school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then just went off to university. My undergraduate study was, in fact, in journalism. I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And while I was an undergraduate, I also got interested in China, which became what I went on to study in graduate school and to work in as a profession. I switched from journalism to history because it didn't look like when I was young that American journalists were ever going to be able to go to China. They, of course, can now, but at that time they could not. And I discovered, in fact, as an undergraduate, what I wanted to do. I think, in fact, this is quite common. I think that certainly there are people who know from the very beginning exactly what they want to do and can go and do it. I certainly wasn't one of those people. And fortunately, the university where I went, Northwestern University, the journalism school, required that journalist students study everything. So you had to study social sciences, natural science, humanities, language, sort of a kind of mixture of things. The idea being that you would then be better prepared to work as a journalist. About third year of undergraduate, I got interested in Chinese history. And while my university did not have regular Chinese classes at the time, I went to summer school to study Chinese and then decided to go to graduate school and ended up going to the University of California at Berkeley, where I did an MA in Asian Studies and a PhD in Chinese history. This was in the 1960s when life in Berkeley was quite lively, to put it mildly. And there were regular demonstrations and various other things. It was the time of the Vietnam War, and the anti-war movement was very strong. The second year I was in graduate school, I decided to go off to Taiwan to do language study. Obviously, if I was going to go on in Chinese history, I had to have better Chinese language skills than I had. And I went to a language school that was run by 20 American universities on the campus of National Taiwan University. It was the most wonderful language school. The basic starting point of the language school was that all the classes were individual tutoring. This was in a period when I suppose the wage levels in Taiwan were not so high, and the universities could afford to hire teachers. So we had all individual tutoring for 5 hours a day. And I lived with a Chinese family. It's kind of what they call immersion language learning. It was very effective. When I got there, I could barely say 2 words. And within 3 months, I could speak reasonably well for everyday things. And by the time I left, my reading skills were certainly much better, although I have to continue to work on them for the rest of my life. I went back to Berkeley and began to start thinking about what came next, how to plan the graduate career. And part of that was search for research questions. What did I want to study, and how was I going to do it? Some people seem to have this all figured out from the very beginning. They have kind of system plotted all the way through their career, and we're going to go from this to this to this. My career was not like that. When I did my MA thesis, it was in the field of what we might roughly call intellectual history. The most famous professor of Chinese history at Berkeley at the time was, in fact, an intellectual historian, studied the thought of Chinese in the 19th, 20th centuries. And so we of his students also all thought we ought to do that. And I ended up writing my MA thesis on a Chinese anarchist from the early 20th century who had himself, in fact, studied in Japan and been the editor of a Chinese newspaper in Tokyo. The time I was in Taiwan, I got my first chance to go see what it was like to go to an archive, to go to look at materials from the early 20th century. And I wrote an MA thesis, and it got passed. And eventually, I went on then to start working on PhD thesis. But at that time, one of my professors said to me, part of it was on the thought of this person, and it was sort of okay. But another part of it was on what happened to him after he was forced to leave Japan and go off to Paris, where he sort of was for 3 or 4 years involved with, this is sort of right before the First World War, was involved with anarchist kind of communes in the suburbs of Paris where they were growing their own vegetables. And he described things like going off to art exhibits where he saw the early work of Picasso, etc. And it was that social history that I discovered I was actually much more interested in. So when I started looking for a PhD topic, I started looking around at the time. I was very interested in the social and economic background of the Chinese Communist Party-led revolution. The grand narratives of the time of the CCP history followed Mao. So wherever Mao was, that was what people were writing about. So, and I became very interested in trying to look at places that weren't part of the central narrative, that, what was going on elsewhere. China is a very big place. What was going on elsewhere, and I began to look for what you might call the social and economic background of the struggles against Japan during the war that then went on to lead into the revolution. And by chance, I came across first a Japanese study and then a Chinese study of the kind of social economic background of this place in Hebei province, which is a place that's about 130 kilometers south of Beijing. It was an area that had, from the early 20th century, had rural industrialization and handicraft weaving. And the first thing I had found was basically a Japanese study done in the 1940s that talked about what had happened from the start of the war. And then I went back and found the Chinese one and what was there before, and I thought, this looks good. And I ended up writing an MA thesis, a PhD thesis, using those materials and various other kinds of publications from China about the anti-Japanese war in North China. When I was finished with it, I was, quite frankly, not very happy. I hadn't been able to find the kinds of interesting materials that I thought I needed. This was a time when the Cultural Revolution was going on in China. Foreign scholars could, of course, not go to China. So I finished the thesis, got it passed, put it aside, and started teaching at a university in Japan. And not too long afterwards, China began to open up to foreigners. The US and China started talking to each other after many, many years of hostility. Nixon went to China in 1972. And shortly after that, you began to get other kinds of exchanges and eventually the opening of formal diplomatic relations. At the time, China was just coming out of a very radical period. They wanted to develop very rapidly. The universities and research institutes had been closed during the Cultural Revolution for 5 or 6 years. Academics had been sent off to the countryside. The situation wasn't very good. And one of the ways they hoped to sort of fix that situation was by sending large numbers of students overseas. And there were negotiations between the Chinese government and the US government, and they decided eventually, they agreed on not exactly an exchange, but of a mutual kind of opening up to each other. Large numbers of Chinese students began to go to the US. Almost all of them were in the hard sciences. And at the same time, it became possible for Americans to go to China. A group that had been working on this for a long time, called the Committee on Scholarly Communications with the People's Republic of China, which was founded an organization that was supported by the National Science Foundation in the US, the Social Science Research Council, and the American Council of ACL, American Council of Liberal Studies, got together to work on this. And I was applied for and got a grant to go to China in 1979, 1980, the first full year of the academic exchange. It was quite an adventure. Nobody knew what was going to happen. I asked to go to Nankai University in Tianjin, which was a university that in the period before the war, before 1949, had a major center for the study of contemporary Chinese economy, and they had done studies on all the places I wanted to go and see, including the place that I had written my PhD thesis on. So I went off to Nankai University in 1979 and 1980. The picture on the right is of me with the two people who were sort of in charge of me, Professor Ding, who was an economist, and Miss Lung, who was supposed to be sure that I survived and took care of everything. And off we went, and I began to dig into the library at the university and to talk about going out to do field work in the countryside. In the next part of this, I want to talk a little bit about finding a methodology for the kind of work that I was doing. And for me, anyway, part of the key words here is serendipity, things that kind of happen, but not by some kind of prearranged plan. They just sort of manage to come together. In the end, I've come up with a kind of, I suppose you could call it research methodology, although it's not very hard and fixed, which combines the kinds of things that traditionally historians did, which means reading old books and documents, with field work and oral history. I started out working in what in the Chinese field is called modern Chinese history, which is basically when I started, ended in 1949. The assumption was that things that happened after the revolution belonged to people in other disciplines, to sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and not to those of us in history. But when I went there, it was right before my eyes, and I will talk about more of this as we go along. The university where I was had this pre-war tradition of field work in North China. They had sent many research teams out, both into the city of Tianjin, which is at the time was China's second or third largest city. And they had also sent them out into the countryside all over North China to do research. So they had records from some of this. I also was very fortunate to discover that the Chinese scholars in the university were willing to go out and do field work, were willing to take me out to places in the countryside. And I said, when I say willing to, it was not easy. I mean, one of the things as you build your careers, if you're studying places other than your home country, you will discover is that research conditions vary a great deal from country to country. In China, the research conditions, certainly in the early 1980s, were quite restricted. If I wanted to leave the city of Tianjin, I had to go to the police and get a special internal passport. And in some ways, I worried that it was a little risky for the professors who were working with me, but they were happy to do it. They had been blocked from doing academic work for some time. And for them, it was also exciting again to be able to go out and do things. The third thing that came along that made this very fortuitous, I was trying to figure out something about rural industry and particularly about business networks and how capital was raised and how people interacted. The Nankai University professors in the 1930s had done a study of the place that I interested in, the place that I was studying. But when they published it, there was no specific they had anonymized the data, so you couldn't tell what company they were talking about or what entrepreneur they were talking about, or you couldn't get at the stories behind that. And one of the things I wanted to do was get at those stories behind the building of this kind of local industry. It was very fortunate timing. In the early 1980s, the people who had been active in local industry from the 30s to the 50s were still there, and they were willing to discuss their experiences. So I discovered that I could in fact, do oral history with them. And this industry, which had originally been all private and small scale, had in the 1950s been collectivized, and many of the operations that had been in either very small private firms or what have you had been turned into state firms, and those state firms were still there, and they were also happy to come and to talk about their factory's history or their history. And I also learned a lot about technology from them, since they took me into the factories and showed me the machines and showed me what you could do with them. And then in 1990, the Chinese archives, state archives, which had been closed up until that time, were opened. And it became possible to get things from the side of business organizations and various other aspects. Eventually, this came to produce these two books, but it took quite a long time to get there. And I want to talk now a bit about why it took so long and what happened along the way, because I think part of when you think about a research career, some of your research careers may go in a straight line from question to answer to question to answer. Mine certainly didn't. The item on the left is the English version. The item on the right is the Chinese translation. The English version came out in 2006, the Chinese in 2010. While I was working on this, I got involved in a whole series of other kinds of projects with various friends in Japan and in China and in the US. The main study of this book is what I suppose in broad terms falls in the field of economic history or business history. The subtitle you can see is Rural Entrepreneurship in the 20th Century. It looks at, in fact, changes over from basically 1900 to 2000. I also got involved through the work on this in work on trade history, on the history of technology and technology transfer, on gender history and looking at the role of women, sort of gender division of labor. And I finally also, which I will talk about at the very end, started writing about some things on what was happening to society. And I have a paper out on the sex trade in this small town in the 1930s. I want to spend some time now talking about what I call collaborations, short-term and long-term collaborations. I think many societies, many academic traditions do a lot with collaboration, but Japanese do it maybe more than others. Tokyo is a wonderful place for collaborations. There's a very large Japanese academic community, which has a tradition, in fact, of what are called kenkyukai research groups. Some of them are short-term. So a group will get together for 2 or 3 years with the project in mind, and they may then produce a conference and a book out of the project, and it'll break up and somebody will make a new project and a new kind of short-term collaboration. But there are also long-term collaborations, and I'll talk about one of these later on. I actually think these kind of collaborations are wonderful. They do all sorts of things. They sort of push you ahead. If you get involved in collaborations, you have goals and deadlines and people who are waiting for you to do things. And so it keeps you sort of moving forward. So that's one thing that's very good. But a second thing is that you can really learn from people who you're associating with who are doing slightly different things. So one of the groups that I got involved with while I was working on this other project was a Japanese-British project on textile history. And it brought together all of the most prominent British textile historians with those in Japan who work on it. So now you may say, why why textile history in both Japan and England. If you look at kind of the stories of the modern nation, they're very much tied up with industrialization. And in both countries, the industrialization started with textile industries, with cotton spinning and weaving, and also in Japan, both cotton spinning and weaving, and also silk. And so the kind of story of the coming of the modern economy and the modern nation is tied up very closely with textiles. Back in the 80s, there was a project that brought together Japanese and British textile historians. Went on for 3 or 4 years. We had meetings in Japan, meeting in Manchester, which is the center, of course, was the center of the British textile industry. And it not only did I learn an awful lot about textile history from them and how you could go, what sorts of things you could do, but I also learned an immense amount about technology, which I had not particularly paid attention to. I'd been interested in kind of credit networks and accumulation of capital and things of that. But the textile historians, at least some of whom, worked very much on how the impact of different kinds of technology on social arrangements and what was possible with different kinds of spinning equipment, or what was likely to come about as a result of that. And through that project, I obviously wrote a paper for it, but I also learned things that I didn't already know. And this is true of the other kinds. I put up here some of the projects I've been involved in. I'm going to talk a bit more about the next one on this list, a research project on North China villages that involves Japanese colleagues, Chinese colleagues, and involved during the war years, Japanese scholars had conducted various kinds of research in China, and there was one very big project that is on trying to figure out the kind of nature of the Chinese village and how it was different in its sociological aspects, anthropological aspects, etc., from Japanese villages. And as part of that, this big project, which was funded by a semi-state company called the South Manchurian Railroad, which had a big research bureau in China, they had combined with scholars from Tokyo University and had, over a number of years, had conducted massive research in 6 North China villages. And then in the 1950s, after the war, the scholars who'd been involved had gathered all the materials, and they had published them in 6 big volumes, which included the transcripts, the question and answer transcripts of all of the interviews. And those books, those studies, had then become the basis for study of Chinese villages, not only by Japanese scholars, but by scholars in the Western world. They'd become the main source. And we went back to those villages in the 90s over a long period of time to try to figure out what had happened to the villages later on. A third research group that I've belonged to for a very long time is one on Chinese women's history. And it's still going on. Our women's history research group is celebrating its 45th anniversary this year. So you can tell it's been on. Some of the older members are no longer alive, but there is a steady stream of sort of younger people coming in. And then I've belonged to a couple of research groups on East Asian trade history that have looked at the connections between Japan, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and various aspects of East Asian trade in various periods. And those East Asian trade history things are kind of the beginning of what later became global history concerns. The 2 books I showed you before, the ones on the place that I have been studying for so long, I did the first research, well, I studied the place for part of my PhD dissertation, but I put aside the political concerns, thinking that there was any place to take it, and turned it into an economic history project. Worked on it in the time that I was in China in 1980, 79, 80. Came back to Japan, started to write up a draft. Then I had a baby, so that took some time out, and I put that in because I think probably for many women scholars, in fact, there's always a problem of trying to balance the personal and the professional considerations. Fortunately, my mother-in-law was very helpful, and my son does not seem to resent the fact that his mother was usually in China in the summer doing field work when he was growing up. When he was on summer vacation, he seemed to manage okay. But it's a concern, I think, and maybe if you have questions or comments, we can talk about how you make them fit. I must say I was fortunate that in the time I was doing this, the kind of pressure on young scholars for immediate publication was considerably less. At the time, Japanese universities either hired with or without tenure. There was no tenure track, and I had a position that had tenure. So if things got delayed a little bit, there was not so much trouble. Anyway, I had written this draft and was getting ready to send it off to a publisher in 1985 when friends at Nankai University said, as a result of the economic reforms, private businesses again reviving in the place you study, there's all this kind of new stuff going on. Don't you want to come and see it? And I said, yeah, I'd really like to come and see it. And so I went, and then I went again and again and again to try to follow what was going on and to see how it connected with what was there before. So the book that I had thought was going to be a book talking about rural industrialization and ending with the process of socialization and the end of private industry, in fact, turned into a book that then looked not only at the earlier part, but the revival of customs from the pre-revolutionary past and how they had been used, in fact, in developing new firms, etc. The place when I first went back in 85 was just beginning to get started. The factories were small and very primitive. When you go now, it's one of the biggest sort of producers, for example, of toweling. And if you buy Chinese-made towels, they're probably made in the place I study, along with various other kinds of things. But it was I had to wait for things to happen. That was the excuse I used, and it took then a long time to be able to see what was happening and to go back and to talk to people and do some mini surveys, etc., to sort it all out. During that time, I got involved in several other projects. The first one was translation of Japanese essays on late imperial Chinese history. I had become convinced that foreign scholars didn't know enough about Japanese scholarship. And since Japanese is not a language that people who take on lightly, it seemed that we might make a contribution by translating some of the kind of fundamental works. And I got together a group of young foreign scholars who were studying in Japan at the time, and we put out a book translating essays on Ming-Qing history. Shortly after that, from 1983, about the same time to 85, I got involved in a project with American friends doing field work in a place called Songjiang in the Shanghai area. There was a group of small villages that had also been studied by the Japanese in the 1940s. And we decided to do a kind of restudy of the place and spent 4 summers going and talking to people, etc. The biggest project I got involved with, however, was with Japanese scholars on the North China villages. You can see the years there when we went. I think we must have interviewed, we did a count, 550 interviews maybe by our team over the period. This was a major project. We did it together with historians at Nankai University. And we did the fieldwork during vacations, which I think is quite the way most academics do a lot of their field work or their research work, away from the teaching time when you can get away. This is just on I've sort of been talking about this, the original study on Chinese rural economy. So our first field work and interviews in 80, was draft in 85, redoing it all in the 85 through 95, and then the new theme for the book, Entrepreneurial Legacies, looking over a century long to see how traditional Chinese business culture, in fact, had been adapted at various points along the way to produce new entrepreneurial forms. This one's sort of out. I'll talk about this one. I'll go ahead and talk about this and then go on. So I now have a retirement project, which, interestingly enough, is still on the same place. It was not what I thought I would be doing, but I go back to Nankai University all the time. I'm a visiting scholar there, and I have many, many close friends. And when I was there a few years ago, we were digging around in some things in a professor's office, boxes that hadn't been opened for a very long time. And we opened one set of boxes and discovered the original field note from the place that I had been studying for so many years, from a 2-year-long sociological study done in 1935, 1936, on how rural industrialization was changing society. The University Research Institute, with money from the Rockefeller Foundation, had sent a team of anywhere, basically 3 to 4 people were there for 2 solid years, observing, interviewing, gathering data, etc. And they had been writing up a report in 1937, and the university was bombed, and they reported to the Rockefeller Foundation that everything was lost. And that seems the end of it. Well, we found these boxes full of the original field notes on large handwritten cards, 5,000, some of them. And I'm now busy reconstructing local society on the eve of the war. We'll come back to that in a little while. I want to talk a bit about the Village Study Project and about how you work out methodology in somewhat difficult circumstances. This is a picture of our team in one of the villages in Shandong. This must be in 1990, maybe. We all look a lot younger than we look now. So there are Chinese, Japanese, and me. One of the tasks we faced in undertaking this project was finding a way and a methodology to talk about what are essentially sensitive issues. I should start by saying that we, needless to say, had to go through all kinds of work to get permission to do the studies to start with. So Nankai University is in Tianjin. The villages were, with one exception, the villages are in other administrative regions. And so the scholars at Nankai first had to get permission from their university. Then they had to get permission from the foreign affairs officials of the counties where the villages were located. Then they had to talk to the villages and get their agreement to talk to us. What we wanted to do, since we had the original materials and had a very good picture of what the villages were like earlier on, we knew all sorts of things about family arrangements, lineage, politics, landowning, agriculture, religion, you name it. It had all been there. And what we wanted to find out was what had happened since then. So, since the early 1940s, through the years of the revolution, through the years of setting up communes and the end of the communes in the late 1980s, those years in China were years of massive political movements. We were doing this not too long after, well, the Cultural Revolution ended in the sort of mid 70s. This was being done very shortly after the Tiananmen incident, and there were many, many politically sensitive issues. We wanted to find out how all those massive movements had played out in the local area in the lives of people. But you couldn't exactly go in and say, okay, tell me what happened to you during the Cultural Revolution, because it would have scared away anybody. They would have been afraid to talk to us, even though we had permission, etc. And so we sort of worked around this issue and eventually came up with an interview method based on life history. And we had a team, and we worked in pairs, a Chinese scholar with a Japanese, including me, scholar. And the first team that interviewed somebody would collect their life history. So we'd start off with the easy stuff: childhood, family, marriage, lineage. Then we'd talk about the economic status of the family. We tried to find out if the people we were talking to had special experiences we should spend more time on. And we discovered that if we did it in this way, if we talked bit by bit, you could, in fact, people were willing to talk about the political movements and other things that came up. If you hit them straight on, they wouldn't have been, but if you went slowly, it worked out more or less okay. This is a kind of interview scene. We did most of the interviews in people's houses. We had their agreement, and we would record the interviews, and then they were transcribed. The interviews have now all been published in Japanese, and and they've also been published in Chinese. That's not where we're supposed to be. So this is one called Considerations. We did these studies at a time before universities required institutional approval for projects with human subjects. The villages that we were studying had all been studied in the 1940s, and there are these massive volumes of the interviews of the people at that time, with the names of the villages, the names of people, etc. So hiding the names, what sociologists or anthropologists usually do now when you are doing something like this, is to produce it without the specific details. You give the villages and the counties fake names, and you give the people fake names so that you don't take any risks. If we were doing it again, I suppose we might have to do that. But since we did it at a time when you didn't have to, the names of the people are all there. And not only that, we have the photos of most of them, which they willingly gave us and which they knew we were publishing. In fact, the village has copies of the books, and they seem very happy to see themselves in them. However, when our Chinese colleagues decided to publish the Chinese transcripts of the same interviews, they went over them very closely to take out anything that they were afraid might get someone in trouble. There wasn't a lot, but there were things that had to do with particularly religious practice that they worried about, and which they did not publish in the printed version, because we didn't want to take the risk of getting anybody in trouble. I assume that many of you also must confront, if you're social scientists, confront this kind of problems in trying to help, in trying to figure out how to convey the content of what you're working on without getting anybody you're talking to into trouble. The next part, I want to talk very briefly about academic associations, journals, and so-called service to the profession. I would assume that many of you as young academics are beginning to get involved in various kinds of academic associations. There are all kinds of academic associations out there, from big professional ones. For example, in my field, probably one of the biggest one is the Association of Asian Studies in the US, and there are organizations like that in Europe, in Australia. There are associations of historians. There are associations of political scientists. There are more specific ones on particular topics that also have ongoing things. Many of the academic associations do the sort of same sorts of things. So one of the things they do is usually run annual conferences. And those annual conferences are an opportunity for scholars, particularly younger scholars, to present their work, to make their debuts into the academic community. Many of the academic associations, probably most of them, publish a journal, which also provides opportunities for scholars, both younger and older scholars, to publish their work. Many of the academic associations run some kind of professional development association for younger scholars. Some of them have job forums, so that if, at least traditionally in the US, many of the academic forums, if you were looking for a job, that would be a place where you could go and talk to people and maybe be interviewed or have a preliminary interview before, if they decided who was going to be on their final short list of candidates. So academic associations do all kinds of useful things that help our academic careers, that help us get through our academic careers. They don't usually have a lot of money, and they depend, in fact, on the voluntary work of academics, of scholars, to keep things going. If you belong to an academic association, you probably know they usually charge an annual fee for membership. And if you go to the conference, you have to pay for the conference. There's a fee for going to the conference. But much of the work of what goes on, say, organizing the annual conference, is done by volunteers who are members of the association. Usually these things move around, often anyway, move around from place to place. And scholars who are in the place close to that association, where the association meeting is held, will do various kinds of volunteer work. There will be people on an organization committee who read all the applications for panels and papers and decide what is going to be accepted and what is not. So that's one form of service, so-called service to the profession. Another major form of service to the profession is something called peer review for journals. Over the past sessions, last time we talked about getting published. And you know that almost all journals, academic journals, use this process of peer review, and they have to find people to do it. They have to find people who are not just getting started out, but who are a little further along, who will read, comment, and provide advice on publications. It's done for very little work. Many of the people on the editor, in fact, probably almost no one on an editorial committee of a journal gets paid for doing it. The editor of a major academic journal may get some time off from their university for service work as an editor of the journal, but it's quite rare for editors to be paid very much. So there's all this kind of voluntary work. I talk about this because I hope when you are thinking about your careers and thinking about the future, that you will include this when you are asked. I have a few friends who say, I don't have the time, I don't want to be bothered with doing any of that. But somebody has to do it, and it works best if it's kind of spread out across the number of people who might be around to help. This is true also for other kind of so-called service work. For example, all of us apply for fellowships. You apply for research grants. I don't know what the situation in Indonesia is, how the granting committees work, but in all the places I do know, which includes particularly Japan and the US, there are committees that are responsible for doing the selection. And the members of those committees, again, it's voluntary work, basically read the applications, take the time to, at least until COVID, go to meetings where they discuss the applications and make decisions about who will get the grants. Almost all that work is pro bono. It's done without any pay. The most you get is, in fact, a trip to meet the other people and a few meals. And otherwise, it's done as service to the profession. I hope when you are thinking about your research careers, you will include in your plans for the research career service to the profession. People often talk about when you write a book or when you write something, you often thank the people who helped you along the way. And another way to thank them is to pay forward, pay to the next generation by doing your part to help the next generation go in the same direction. I think I will stop there and see why don't we see what kind of questions and topics you would all like to discuss. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Linda Gross, for your presentation. We'll jump to questions that I've asked. First of all is from Mario Pascal from Zoom. Hello, Ms. Linda Grove. Do people with bachelor's degree also have a chance to be considered as a researcher? Because the average researcher has at least master's degree. Thank you.
Is it possible for somebody with a bachelor's degree to make a career as a professional researcher? I think it's probably possible, but not easy. And it's going to be easiest to go. I mean, one of the ways you can get started if you're young and just getting is to try to find a job as a research assistant to someone. And you may be able then, through to move on from being a research assistant to developing your own projects. My guess is, however, that with minor exceptions along the way, you're going to have it easier to do if you, in fact, go on and do graduate study. It's not out of the question with a bachelor's degree, but it's not going to be easy to get that first step in the door.
Okay, jump to the next question from BJ Swamintaya from Zoom. between the China and the United States, there's a difference in using language and letter. Did you find any boundary when you communicate with them? And does the Chinese young generation start to change their research from using Chinese to English?
Um, Let me see whether do I find communication gaps? I find communication gaps all the time because I always discover that the Chinese language is changing very rapidly, and what I can read, I read and I talk with friends. Particularly now that it's hard to go because of COVID, I Skype or Zoom with friends in China. But the living language moves very rapidly, and the young people have all kinds of expressions that I don't understand. So on the one level, it's simply a language problem. But if the bigger question I think maybe that you're talking about is in fact the question of how we look at whether it's contemporary events or how we would look at historical problems. The worlds we come from and sometimes and the presumptions we have are quite different. I find it, in fact, it's interesting and challenging to try to understand where they're coming from and where I'm coming from. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. I mean, I think there are clearly different conceptions of the world, different conceptions of what makes a good society, different understandings of how politics and human relations work. And they lead us, in fact, to come up with very different interpretations. So yeah, I find I have to watch all the time, and sometimes I get it all the way wrong. And a friend will say, "No, that's not what that means. This means something else. Or this is what somebody is referring to." For the second question about publishing in English, I think all over Asia there has been a boom in publishing in English. This is partly because of just this week, in fact, one of the major, I can't remember which one it is, but one of the major university ranking systems published their latest kind of calculation of the rankings and of where the universities stand. And because of that university ranking system and the desire of universities all over the world to say, we're number something or we're up, there has been increasing pressure to publish in English. The international ranking organizations basically only count publications in English. I don't happen to think that's a good idea. I'm not in charge of doing this, and so there's not much I can help. As a result of that, I think all of the young scholars all over the world are being pressured to publish in English. And that's true in China as well, although there are some indications that the Chinese Ministry of Education is going to try to put less pressure to publish in English. Now, whether that will happen or not is hard to say. I've often been struck when I read the work of younger Chinese scholars in my field, sort of modern history or modern society, at how well read they are. That when they're doing the kind of literature survey and presenting it, you will find that you have they've looked at works in any number of languages, not just in Chinese or not just in English. They may have read things in Japanese or Korean or French or German, etc. So I think there is an effort on the part of young Chinese scholars to certainly internationalize themselves and their work. And maybe if you have a follow-up question, I can try to answer it.
Okay, next question from Yudanto Dwi Nugroho. Hello, Ms. Groove. From your personal experience, what are the biggest challenges when you face all researchers, and how did you overcome them? Thank you.
What are the biggest problems? I've been involved in the last few years helping with running writing workshops, and I often discover that I should be giving myself the same advice that we give young scholars, that um, it always takes time to sort of sort out what it is you want to say. And the more complicated the problem, I think I personally find writing short articles is the easiest. If you start off with a very specific research question and you have very specific materials, and so it's not so hard to go from A to B to C. Writing books is trickier because you need a bigger kind of framework to put it in and to try to get the pieces to go. Writing overview articles is also trickier. So that's the first one, is sort of being clear about what you want to say. I personally usually sort of go around in sort of little circles, and then you say, okay, this is not clear, and you finally figure out where it should be going. The second is to kind of keep up the second is to stop the research at some point. I personally find the research part of things so interesting, and find it now so much easier to keep it going because of online possibilities. When I was young, one of the things you had to do if you were in my field where you need materials from the past was, for example, if you wanted to look at newspapers or magazines from, say, the early 20th century, first you had to figure out what library had them. Then you had to figure out how you could get yourself there, and then you sort of started reading. Well, now so much is right there in databases with the kind of clicks of the mouse that it's hard to stop. You can just sort of keep pursuing and pursuing and pursuing and putting off the analysis and writing. And so I think, that's a problem of kind of the new kind of research. Is in the past, we often didn't have enough sources. Now we sometimes have way too many, and trying to figure out how to sort them out and come up with arguments that make sense. And then I still think clear writing is probably, which often takes writing and rewriting and rewriting. This is true not only for young people, it's true for people at all stages of their career, to get what you want to say out there clearly. There are, of course, more practical problems, and I don't know whether you want to, I can say a little bit about them. And one of the problems, of course, is figuring out how to get the money to do your research. There are expensive kinds of research and not so expensive kinds of research. My field happens to be one that is not so expensive, since I have to go places to interview people, perhaps, but I don't do massive surveys where you have to hire people to help you and do things like that. And if you're doing that kind of research, then obviously you need to develop techniques for getting research funds. And sometimes you need also to figure out ways of getting access to the people or the communities or the data that you need. And one other one, I noticed it when I was teaching quite frequently. Don't assume that data exists. If you're working in your own country and there's a certain kind of data and you want to compare it with some other place, don't assume that they're going to have the same kind of data. You have to go and check and set up your project so that if it needs comparison, that there actually is data to do the comparison. I'll stop there, and maybe somebody will ask another question that we can come up with, do more.
Okay, so the last question for today from Angias Tirayong Wigati. Hello, Ms. Groove. I would like to ask, were there any challenges in looking for donors to fund your research? Also, how is the relationship between researchers and donor institutions? Do donors have a large influence on the choice of research topics? Thank you very much for your presentation.
I'll talk about the kinds of research funding I've had, and then a little bit about what the Social Science Research Council does, since it runs all kinds of funding programs. It's always tricky to get research funding. In Japan, where my base is, I've applied for both Japanese funding and international funding. The major form of Japanese funding comes through an semi-government organization, but the decisions about who gets funding are all made by committees of academics, and at least in theory, there should be no interference in what is actually done. So there are rules, for example, about how you can use the money and how you have to report the money, but there should not be restrictions from the donors on what you actually do. For the Social Science Research Council, for the programs we run, the principle is that the donor does not interfere in the research. And if there are problems along this line, the Social Science Research Council would probably cut the relationship with the donor for the future. That doesn't mean that there are not all kinds of pressures in research funding, but at least in principle, academic funding is the donor is not supposed to influence the outcome. Now, as you undoubtedly know, if you go to publish an article these days, you are always asked to disclose your funding sources. And this is because, at least in some fields, people who have an interest in the outcome may be funding the research. This is particularly true in biomedicine. It's, I think, usually less so in social sciences. In applying for research funding, and this comes from my experience with Social Science Research Council, one of the first things you want to do is to look very carefully at the stipulations about the grant. Who does it? What is it? What does the outline say? Who is eligible for the grant? You don't want to waste your time or review committee's time if you're not eligible. And it will say, for example, if a certain grant is only available for people who are Indonesian citizens. If you're not, don't apply, right? Or it may be a grant that's available, but there is for junior scholars, and they stipulate that you have to be within 5 years of your PhD. Or it may be a grant for dissertation research. If it's a dissertation grant, don't apply if you've already finished your dissertation. On the other hand, if you're a PhD student, don't apply for one for somebody who's within 5 years of their dissertation. So look very carefully at what it says. Look at what is said about what the grant wants. I say this particularly because there's a big contrast, for example, between many Japanese grants and international grants. Japanese grants tend to have a series of blanks for you to fill in with quite specific data about quite specific information about what you're planning to do. Where many of the international grants want this kind of big, what's the big question, and seem to be less concerned with exactly how you're going to go about answering the questions. Almost all grant proposals will ask you to submit letters of recommendation. I don't know what the custom in Indonesia is. In some countries in Asia, people think that the best way to do that is to find the most famous scholar you know to recommend you. It's in fact not a good strategy. You want to find somebody who actually knows what you do and who can write about it, who can write about you and what you do and what your project is, not somebody who will do a perfunctory kind of letter. It used to be common in Japan. I think it is less so now. That especially for letters that had to be written in English, for somebody to go and ask a professor to write a letter, and the professor, so you give me a draft and I'll sign it. Having sat on committees on the other side, people know when that's happened, and it's not positive for the grant. So, I mean, getting money, getting funds is obviously always tricky. And persistence pays off. If you don't get it the first time round, then keep going, apply again, see if you can figure out, get advice from somebody about what might work better, and try again. I guess, were there other questions there? Was that it?
Yeah, that was it. Thank you for your answer, Miss. And would you like to give a closing remark before we end today's event?
No, I hope all of you find happy careers in research. Research careers don't always pay the most money, but if you're lucky, you get to pursue questions and issues that you find of great interest, and they may take you to very interesting places to meet interesting people. So I wish you all the best of luck with your careers.
Okay, thank you, Miss. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who has participated in today's event. And I would also like to thank our facilitator today for sharing your knowledge with us. And earlier in this event, I asked our audience member a trivia question, which was, in what year was the first academic journal published? And the answer is A, 1665. Shout out goes to Ibnu Al from Instagram for answering the question correctly. And thank you for everyone else who has participated. Also, I would like to invite everyone to follow us on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at AT America. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel and newsletter too for more updates from us. All right, with that, I think it is time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I am Andrea, and see you at the next At America event. Thank you.